And sitting beside Elizabeth is Danny Graham, the former leader of the Nova Scotia Liberal Party, former MLA for this very riding in which we sit, Halifax Citadel. He is the chair of a new organization called Envision Nova Scotia. It aims to support greater involvement of citizens in shaping the direction and vision of Nova Scotia. He currently serves as a special advisor at the law firm McGuinness Cooper. This is Danny Graham.
Thank you, Stephanie. It's been about 8 years since I've been in a public political forum, and listening to the oratory of my colleagues leads to my heart quickening, me saying to myself, I want to get back in. And there's another part of me that says, I really don't want to get back in. And I left out the funny parts that they so easily come to, and then I remembered, I'm not really funny. So I want to share with you the perspective of somebody who was in politics for only about 3.5 years and who has been out for 8 years. Unlike my colleagues, I've been in your seat more than I've been in their seat for the last little while. I'm honored to be on a panel with them, and I have followed what they've done, particularly Elizabeth and Graham, much more closely over the years, and respect these colleagues tremendously. And I'm mindful of the wisdom that's already in the room. I want to congratulate Mark and the others at Springtide for hosting this conversation. I hope that it's the first of many conversations like this, because we need so much more of this, and I'll try to make that point as we go along. My comments are going to touch on, and we were asked in the notes we received to consider our personal reflections about our experience. And for me, in relation to the conversation that we're having this evening, there were 3 wake-up calls that I've experienced in my time in public life. And I'd like to share some of those with you. But before I begin, I'd like to put my cards on the table about where I stand with respect to democratic renewal more generally, which I think is the vital discussion that we need to have. While innovation has occurred across the sectors of science and technology and medicine and business all across the world, it has propelled us in so many ways. I believe that the institutions and processes of democracy in Canada has failed to innovate at all. And while free and democratic elections have arguably been the most important social development in the last 200 years in the entire world, early adopters to democracy, like Canada, have not adapted or improvised to changing times and expectations, to social norms and technology. More concerning than that is that as the complexity of these issues continues to rise, for example, we realize that the intersection between poverty, crime, health, housing, and so many other issues are interconnected. Our ability to respond to those challenges with political leadership seems to have diminished. And the need for transformative change has never been greater than it is right now. Consider for a moment the challenges associated with global warming worldwide. And consider whether or not we have stalled in our ability to tackle these things, particularly in Canada. That's not a comment about any particular political party, because I think that we've stalled. All the parties are guilty of not moving quickly enough on this particular matter. They seem to be handcuffed because I think we've stayed with a political design from 1867 that feels strangely like we're driving a Model T Ford. The only meaningful opportunity the public has to consistently participate is still just in elections. And most of the people we elect have little say. Unelected, well-intentioned political staff, usually in the office of the prime ministers, premiers, political leaders of all stripes, choreograph the questions, the answers, the talking points, and the speeches. I have a personal experience with that, which actually led to me returning from Ottawa and getting involved in politics. It was 2001. And after 9/11, I was working in the Justice Department in Ottawa, and I was asked by the Associate Deputy Minister to move away from the subjects that I went to Ottawa to work on and to move to work on Canada's anti-terrorism legislation, something that I knew I would have mixed feelings about, Bill C-35. And a sort of SWAT team of criminal justice policy people were brought together to build a piece of legislation for the department and make sure that it made it through the legislature in lickety-split time. It was at the time that the Patriot Act was just recently passed in the United States. So we pulled this thing together. We were informed by international experts. And one of the jobs that I filled was that I was a courier or a resource for parliamentarians on the government side of the bench who were debating the topic. What I realized at the end was that I really was just a courier of speeches that we had written in the department for people to read on the House of the Legislature that any junior high kid in Canada would have been able to read without understanding anything about the work that they had done. About 2 days after I realized this, I went home to my wife and I told her about this opportunity to run for the leadership of the Liberal Party back in Nova Scotia, and that the quality of the debate in public institution was clearly not at a level that it needed to be. And she knew after a stalled question on this matter in the spring of that year that I really meant it this time. And a month later, we were back in Halifax and I was in the middle of that race. As I became a politician, it was the first time that I had been involved in a political meeting of any type as an adult. And I was running for the leadership of a major political party. I was a neophyte. The most troubling things that occurred to me as I went through that exercise really was about the hyperbole, the exaggerations, the theater that dominated the landscape of political discourse. Does anyone watch Question Period? Parties pretend that everything they say is the gospel and everything that the other side says is really from a comic book, which led to my wake-up number 2. Premier Ham, in the spring of 2002, was announcing the appointment of 2 new cabinet ministers in areas of the province where it was questionable about whether or not those seats were going to be won in the next election. So some of my advisors, particularly my caucus members, were advising me to go over there and slam the government for playing politics by appointing cabinet ministers. But these were in the communities of Dartmouth that didn't have anyone at the executive table, and in industrial Cape Breton, where they didn't have anyone at the cabinet table. And so I went over and I listened to the appointment of these 2 ministers, and I was scrummed by the media about what had just happened, and I chose to say that good for Dartmouth, good for North Sydney, and the people in industrial Cape Breton to have somebody around the table who is actually able to represent their interests when big decisions are being made. 2 days later, one of my staff members told me that someone from the press corps wanted to speak to me about the facts of life in politics. They set up a meeting with this reporter. It was a breakfast meeting where he said to me that there had already been discussion amongst the people in the political corps that they will stop reporting on me if I don't start getting more negative. So I did. I became more negative for a period of time. And what I realize in my experience in that is that it's superficial to attach the responsibility of the problems we have in politics to political leaders and to parties. It appears that this is the result of the action of many parties, including ourselves and the media, who feed on the theater of conflict and personality over and over. So this is everyone's problem. We've all caused it, and I think we all have a responsibility to change this Model T that we've been riding for so long. And it's more than just a look under the hood of this vehicle. What would happen if we engaged in a broad and deep conversation with Canadians about what we really want from our democracy? What do we want from our political parties? What do we want from our legislatures? What if we consider the best innovations from emerging democracies? Democratic renewal isn't a very sexy subject. I learned that the hard way. In the fall of 2002, I came out with our party's first major political announcement. A few in the room might remember it. It was called Citizen-Centered Democracy. It was about realigning the relationship between government and citizens. It was about opening the doors to government and politics to allow citizens to have a central place in what was happening. It was met with scowls from the opposition and even concern from the inside of our party. And people asked, why isn't he talking about roads or emergency rooms or auto insurance? That was my wake-up number 3. Fortunately, as Stephanie mentioned, I've been involved with a citizen organization called Envision Nova Scotia, which is concerned with engaging people in those questions and bringing citizens more to the center of what we're trying to do. My view is that we need a redesign. And I think that party discipline and the questions and the problems associated with it are the thin edge of a larger wedge. My primary concern about party discipline is that it's controlled by the Prime Minister's office and Premier's offices and party leaders' offices. In some respects, I think it does serve a purpose, particularly when the parties are voting, the elected members are voting on matters that actually have been part of party platforms and were the reason why that party is the governing party at the time. But its gross overuse is clearly distorted in a way that disempowers elected people. And ultimately, it disempowers you, the people who elected them. It happens at nominations, at cabinet selection, at legislative voting, at committee work. In all of these systems, we need the design rule. We need to design rules that limit the concentration of power of the people at the top of the food chain. We need to insist and recognize that however unsexy democratic renewal is, it's perhaps the most important political issue of our time. Thanks very much.
So what we have is an abomination. You've heard what Brent said. I will go farther and say...
Why have our political parties essentially turned into fundraising and election machines rather than vehicles for developing good public policy?
As a backbench member of Parliament, to what extent do I subject myself to their attempts at control?